The hospital monitor beeps at 3:17 in the morning. A steady rhythm, almost musical, if anything about this moment could be called beautiful. But there is nothing beautiful here. In the intensive care unit of St. Michael's Hospital, in Manchester, a child lies unconscious. Tubes. Machines. The soft hiss of oxygen being forced into lungs that no longer remember how to work on their own. A nurse named Eleanor makes her rounds. She's worked this ward for 23 years. She has seen suffering become routine. But tonight, something stops her. She reads the chart twice. Then again. The name is listed correctly. But there is another name. The exact same name. 2 different patient files. 2 different beds. The same identity scattered across 2 bodies. She thinks she's made a mistake. She checks the computer system. The records confirm it. Somewhere in this hospital, right now, at this exact moment, a second Thomas is also fighting for breath. The monitor beside him beeps in a different rhythm, slower, irregular, like a heartbeat that's forgetting how to beat. Eleanor has worked in medicine her entire life. But she has never felt afraid of a patient's name before. We must go back. Far back. To 1847. To a village in northern England that most maps don't bother to name. The moorlands are grey there, and the sky is greyer still. The wind carries something old, older than memory, older than the stones that build the cottages where families live and die and are born again. The Ashworth family had farmed these lands for 200 years. They were unremarkable, respectable, God-fearing. There is nothing in the parish records that suggests anything extraordinary about them. Until the day the twins were born. Thomas Ashworth the elder's wife gave birth on a cold March evening. The midwife, a woman named Catherine, attended the birth herself. In her records, written in ink that has since faded to a rust color, she documented the event with simple words. 2 sons. Both healthy. Both born within minutes of each other. What the records do not explain is why they were given the same name. Thomas and Thomas. No distinction. No middle initials. No way to tell them apart in any official document. It was considered unusual even then. The vicar who baptized them asked about it. The record shows his question. The Ashworth family offered no explanation. This is where the story should have remained, a peculiarity. A quirk of one family. Instead, something far stranger began to unfold. Thomas the elder had 2 sons, both named Thomas. When those twins came of age, they married. Each had children. And when their children were born, both sets of twins, they too were named Thomas. No variation. No rebellion against the family tradition. No attempt to distinguish or differentiate. For 7 generations, this continued. The second Thomas had twins named Thomas. The third Thomas had twins named Thomas. The family tree, which should have branched and spread like any normal lineage, instead folded back on itself. Every twin bearing the same weight, the same name, the same identity. By the 20th century, the Ashworths had become a strange footnote in genealogical records. Curious academics would occasionally study the family tree. They published papers. A case of unusual naming conventions in rural British families, one headline read. Cultural persistence and identity in isolated communities, read another. But no one asked the question that mattered, why? The family itself seemed to have forgotten. When distant cousins asked about it, they received only shrugs. The tradition simply was. It existed the way seasons exist, the way death exists, as something that has always been and will always be. No one alive could remember a single reason why they continued the practice. We come now to the 8th generation. To Marcus and Daniel Ashworth, born in 1989 in a small town called Hebden Bridge, on the border between Yorkshire and Lancashire. Fraternal twins, different in almost every way except for one thing, they share the same name. Thomas. Marcus is the elder by 7 minutes. He is tall, angular, with dark eyes that seem to study everything before trusting it. Daniel is shorter, broader, with the kind of face that strangers find immediately friendly. They look nothing alike. But they are forever tied together by a name. It was confusing, Marcus would later say, in one of the few interviews he gave before everything changed. From the very first day of school, we were the same person to everyone else. Teachers called on Thomas, and both of us would look up. Neither of us was sure if the question was meant for us or our brother. Daniel nodded when Marcus spoke. Our mother tried to help. She called us Big Thomas and Little Thomas at home. But the world didn't do that. The world just knew us as Thomas. It's like being tethered to someone. You can love that person, but you're still tethered. By their teenage years, they had learned to live with the confusion. Love letters came addressed to Dear Thomas. Report cards listed them both as Thomas A. Medical records, already in the digital age, became a nightmare of cross-referenced complications. When Marcus broke his arm at 17, the hospital initially treated Daniel. When Daniel had an allergic reaction at 22, the ambulance almost took Marcus to the hospital. But they survived it. They developed coping mechanisms. They created their own identity within the shared name. They were not unique, but they were themselves. Or so they believed. In October of 2019, Marcus began to feel unwell. It started subtly. A persistent tremor in his left hand. Migraines that lasted for days. A kind of fatigue that sleep could not cure. He saw his GP, who prescribed rest. He saw a neurologist, who was puzzled. The symptoms didn't fit any standard pattern. MRI scans showed nothing. Blood tests revealed no infection. By November, he could no longer work. He was admitted to St. Michael's Hospital on November 17. 3 days later, Daniel developed identical symptoms. This is the moment where doctors began to take notes. This is the moment where case files opened and eyes widened. The odds of two fraternal twins developing the same rare, unidentified neurological condition within 72 hours of each other are not just unlikely. They are, for all practical purposes, impossible. But it didn't stop there. Marcus's cousin Andrew, born into a branch of the family 40 miles away, also shared the name Thomas. In December, Andrew was admitted to a different hospital with the same constellation of symptoms. Within 2 weeks, his twin brother, also named Thomas, showed signs of illness. Then their uncle's children. Different generation, same name. Same impossible illness. The hospitals began to communicate. Doctors convened. The name Thomas Ashworth appeared in research groups and diagnostic committees. Neurologists from across the country became obsessed with understanding what was happening to a small family with an unusual naming tradition. No one could find an answer. As the illness progressed, the survivors, and there were survivors, began to speak of something that medicine had no framework for. Something that doctors actively resisted hearing. They described a sensation of shared consciousness. Not metaphorical. Not poetic. Not something that could be dismissed as emotional twins feeling connected. Something that felt like a direct link between two minds. I felt the moment he experienced pain, Daniel said, weeks into his illness, from a hospital bed. Not imagined it. Not worried about it. I felt it. Like it was happening in my own body, except I knew it wasn't. I was lying in a bed at St. Michael's. I was unconscious. But I felt Marcus's pain anyway. I felt it in places where I had no nerve endings. The medical team documented this. They made notes. They looked for signs of psychological breakdown, shared delusion, folia dux. But there was something in the consistency of these claims that was hard to dismiss. Family after family, unconnected geographically, separated by miles, reported the same inexplicable phenomenon. One Thomas described the moment his cousin's Thomas died. It happened in different cities, in hospitals that had never communicated. He was awake when it happened, awake and screaming, because he could feel something being severed. Something being torn away. When the hospital called to tell him that his cousin had died at that exact moment, he was not surprised. The neurologists called it shared delusion. The psychiatrists called it trauma bonding. The families called it something else. They didn't have a word for it. But they knew what they experienced was real. Then, abruptly, the conversation stopped. Hospital records went sealed. No official statement was ever released. The few doctors who had begun publishing preliminary findings were quietly reassigned to other departments, other hospitals, other cities. One researcher at Oxford who had begun writing a paper on the phenomenon was told his funding was being redirected. The story disappeared. Local journalists who had covered the hospital admissions, dramatic enough for regional news, found their follow-up calls going unanswered. Requests for interviews were declined. The families, frightened by the attention, by the strangeness, by something they couldn't understand, stopped speaking to press entirely. Within 6 months, there was almost no public record that any of this had happened. But in the quiet spaces between official silence, the whispers continued. Online forums filled with theories. Reddit threads dissected the fragments of information that had been released before the institutional shutdown. Conspiracy theorists wove elaborate narratives around government cover-ups and supernatural phenomena. The truth, whatever it was, had been buried. What remained was a void. A gap in the record. A collective amnesia imposed by institutions that seemed terrified of the implications of what they had witnessed. To those who lived through it, the silence was more disturbing than any official explanation could have been. It suggested that someone, somewhere, understood what was happening. And that understanding was too dangerous to share. Years later, long after the hospital visits had ended, long after the affected Thomases had scattered across the country trying to rebuild their lives, a retired archivist named Helen Whitmore was cataloguing old family documents in the county records office. She found a letter. It was dated March 15, 1847. Written in a careful, aged hand. It was tucked inside a flap of the family Bible, the same Bible that had been passed down through 8 generations of Ashworths. The letter had never been seen by historians. Had never been published. Had never been mentioned in any official genealogy. The letter was addressed to no one. It was signed by no one. But the handwriting matched other documents written by the same woman, the wife of Thomas Ashworth the elder. The woman who had given birth to the first twins bearing the same name. Helen read it 3 times before she understood what she was reading. In careful, almost desperate script, the woman described a bargain. She didn't name what she had made the bargain with. The text was deliberately vague, as if the author was afraid that even writing it down too explicitly would be dangerous. But she described a promise made in exchange for something she wanted: prosperity, protection, the survival of a family line in a harsh and dying land. The price, she wrote, was that the family would be bound in blood and name. That identity would become fluid and intertwined. That in exchange for their security, future generations would carry the weight of an impossible unity. She wrote, "I have done this thing, and I cannot undo it. My sons will bear the same name, and their sons will bear the same name, and the weight will fall on them. But they will survive. They will prosper. And perhaps they will never know the cost that I paid for this bargain." The letter ended abruptly. The final words were barely legible, as if written in trembling hands, "God forgive me." Whether this was evidence of genuine supernatural experience, or the documentation of a woman's mental breakdown, no one could say. The archivist brought the letter to academic colleagues. Historians debated its authenticity. Some argued it was a forgery. Others suggested it was an elaborate journal entry, the creative fiction of a woman documenting psychological distress through metaphor. But it raised a question that no one could ignore: what had she known? What had driven her to make this choice? And had she cursed her family, or blessed them? The living Thomases have attempted to move forward. Marcus, the first to fall ill, survived the neurological crisis. But he carries permanent damage. A tremor in his left hand that never fully resolved. Memory gaps. Sensory processing problems that make normal life require constant accommodation. He works part-time now, when he can manage. He rarely speaks about what happened. Daniel eventually recovered more completely, but not entirely. He experiences episodic numbness. Night terrors. A persistent sense of dislocation from his own body. He changed his name legally at 28. He is now Michael. It was an attempt to sever himself from the curse, if curse it was. From the pattern. From the weight of history. Other Thomases followed suit. His cousin Andrew changed his name to Alexander. Andrew's twin changed his to Joshua. They were running from something they couldn't name, toward identities they hoped would be untethered and free. But some of the Thomases refused to change. They clung to the name, to the family identity, as if breaking the chain would be a betrayal of something sacred. They returned to the rural villages where the Ashworth family had lived for centuries. They married and had children. They waited to see if the pattern would continue. The family had fractured. Not because of death, though some had died, but because of something more subtle. An unwillingness to accept an inheritance that carried both blessing and curse. The newest generation of Ashworths has broken the naming pattern. When the most recent twins were born, in 2021, the parents named them something different. Eleanor and Thomas. Not identical names. Not a continuation of an 8-generation legacy. It was relief, perhaps. Or defiance. But the question remains unresolved. No one knows if the connection, the shared consciousness, the impossible synchronicity, was tied specifically to the name. Perhaps it was. Perhaps it was something else entirely. Perhaps the bargain that had been made, generations ago, could only persist while the name remained the same. Perhaps breaking the chain has broken the curse. Or perhaps the pattern is simply waiting. Sleeping. Dormant in the genetic code, in the family blood, waiting for the moment when the name will be passed down again. And somewhere, far from the grey moors of Yorkshire, children are being born to distant Ashworth relatives. Children who don't yet know their family story. Children whose parents have never heard the whispers, the theories, the carefully erased hospital records. What happens when they grow old enough to ask about their ancestry? What happens when they learn that their family once carried a name that bound generations together in ways that medicine couldn't explain? Will they choose to resurrect the tradition? Will they ignore it? Or will something in their blood, something deep and old and impossible to name, make the choice for them? The hospitals are quiet now. The case files remain sealed. The doctors have moved on to other mysteries, other impossibilities. But in the Ashworth family, there is a waiting. A tension. A question that remains forever unanswered. And perhaps that uncertainty is the most frightening thing of all.